Well, good morning, everyone. I think this may be the coolest place in Lakeside, frankly. I am John Mann, Director of Education, and we are fortunate today that Jim Kraft has joined us again for a presentation on Benedict Arnold, from hero to great American trader. Benedict Arnold is a well-known villain in American history, and today we're going to learn about more about his life as a hero and also his life as a trader. Jim is interested in researching and is a frequent presenter on American history from a local perspective. He's spent his professional career teaching history, writing, and developing instructional material that is currently working on a series of short history books. I would ask if you would please mute your cell phone ringers if you haven't already, and help me in welcoming Jim Kraft.
All righty, am I on? Y'all hear me? Okay, so we're going to talk about Benedict Arnold, and as John said, most of this talk is about Benedict Arnold, the hero, quite honestly. There's very little doubt that until he went over to the dark side, he was pretty widely recognized by the Americans and the British as the most formidable battlefield commander that the Americans had. He was quite something, really, in what he accomplished prior, as I say, to going over to the dark side. September 23rd, 1780, on the Albany Post Road just north of Tarrytown and just south of Sleepy Hollow. So those of you who are familiar with the legend of Sleepy Hollow and Ichabod Crane and pumpkins being thrown off the head of Headless Horseman, he's about a half mile. This incident that I'm going to talk about occurs about a half mile south of that bridge. And on that morning, 9, 10 o'clock, somewhere on the morning of the 23rd, in an area that was kind of no man's land between the British and American lines. The Americans were further north, and their lines were set up towards West Point. And the British lines were set up further south towards Yonkers. But in between those lines, you had this no man's land. And they were patrolled to some extent by colonial militiamen and by British Tories. And there's some dispute as to whether these guys were just scoundrels and robbing anybody who came through the area, or whether they were really representing their respective sides. The point is that down the road, around 9 or 10 o'clock on the 23rd, this lone horseman is coming. Kind of sitting out in the woods, listening to their Walkman or whatever. There are a few colonial soldiers, John Paulding, Isaac Van Wart, and David Williams. And they hear this horse coming down the road. They jump out, stop. They stop and start to question this guy who identifies himself as John Anderson. And almost immediately, John Anderson tipped his hand. He knew he was in no man's land, but he assumed the guys that stopped him were Tories, were loyalists, reporting essentially to the British general in New York, Henry Clinton. And so he says, kind of the first words out of his mouth, tip the hand that he's a Tory. So they stop him. They start talking to him. Eventually, he pulls out a pass signed by the general at West Point, a chap by the name of, Benedict Arnold. It's like, here's my pass. But they were very suspicious, and so they searched him. One of the things that he did that I don't think really helped his cause any is he started to try to bribe him. I'll give you 100 guineas if you let me through. Do you want anything? Let me through. And oh, by the way, I've got this pass. And they're going, I think we'll search you. So they search him. He takes off, they get him to take off his boots, and between his feet and his stocking, he has maps and plans for West Point. Well, turns out this isn't John Anderson. It's Major John Andre, who was essentially Henry Clinton's chief of intelligence. Now, these guys didn't know that exactly, but they knew he sounded like a spy and he had documents of West Point. And so what they did is they got on their cell phone and called their boss, who was stationed a few miles away, and told him that they had this guy. The bell ringers are here. All right. Told this guy that, they had this spy, what they thought was a spy. So he's kind of turned over, and the colonial, he's a lieutenant colonel, and his name escapes me, but he kind of talked to John Anderson and decided that he needed to notify his boss, who was, of course, the commander at West Point, Benedict Arnold. So he sends a rider up to West Point, which is about 20 miles away. Well, not to West Point, to the Robinson House, which is where Benedict Arnold was living. Now, interestingly, Benedict Arnold was living on the opposite side of the river of West Point. Okay, he was on the east side of the Hudson River. West Point is on the west side. In order for Benedict Arnold to get back and forth to West Point, he had basically a rowboat, a barge at his command that was constantly manned. In any event, messenger heads up the shore to get to Benedict Arnold and tell him that they found this spy. At the same time, they send off a rider to find George Washington with the documents and tell George Washington that they had captured this spy, and here are the documents they found on him. Those were sent off to Washington. Now these guys, Washington's headquarters mostly in this time frame were in Newburgh, north of West Point. But at this time, he had been in Hartford visiting with Count Rochambeau, who was the commander of the French army, also with the commander of the French Navy that was in the area. So Washington's there. These guys knew, or at least their commander knew, that Washington was in the area, and so they sent off riders to find Washington. It took them till Monday to find him. This was a Saturday morning. The messenger goes to the Robinson House. Arnold is having breakfast with his wife, Peggy Shipman Arnold, and some of his aides. The guy walks in with this note, gives it to Benedict Arnold. He's sitting there having his bacon and eggs, and his face goes white, apparently. And he gets up, goes out into the hallway, calls his wife, Peggy, out into the hallway, and immediately skedaddles. Gets on his horse, rides south, or actually rides to the river, gets the bargemen who would usually take him across to West Point and said, go south, I've got to go downstream. He's going downstream to meet the HMS Vulture. The Vulture had carried John Andre up to the meeting point, or close to the meeting point, where Benedict Arnold and John Andre had met the previous night, at which Arnold had turned over these plans to West Point. So he gets on this barge, goes downstream, finds the HMS Vulture, says to his crewmen, who were guys that have been carrying him back and forth to West Point since he took over command there in June or July, and say, listen, fellas, I'll give you commissions. I'll make you a sergeant, I'll make you a corporal, I'll give you a reward if you want to come with me. But I'm leaving. I'm going over to the British. And he climbs on board the Vulture. These guys didn't go with him. That they didn't shoot him is a bit surprising. But Arnold gets on the ship, and the Vulture turns around and heads to New York City. And by that evening, he's having dinner with General Clinton in New York City. Meanwhile, the next day is Sunday. Washington is spending most of his time that day. As he's coming back from Hartford, he's kind of visiting the fortifications along the Hudson River around the West Point area. And so he's he's about 20 miles north of of where John Andre was captured, about 40 miles north of there. He's about 20 miles north of Arnold's house. And he's kind of wandering around in the area. He's there on Saturday afternoon, he's there on Sunday, he's there. And then on Monday, the plan was to go over to Arnold's house and tour West Point with Benedict Arnold and probably spend the night at Arnold's house on Monday night, the 25th. He gets to Arnold's house, Arnold isn't there, and he's a little bit like, why isn't he here? He knew I was coming. And, he's gone off to visit stuff at West Point. He's there with Peggy Shippen Arnold, and some of his aides, including Alexander Hamilton. And this is where the messenger catches up with him, is at the Robinson house on Monday morning. And he walks in, and I think Alexander Hamilton actually took the message initially and started to look at it and went over to the general and said, you might want to see this. And of course, I don't think Washington's face got white. My guess is it got beet red, because immediately he and Alexander Hamilton could see that Arnold had gone over. And of course, Washington is furious. Arnold had been an incredible hero. He had his problems. Washington always backed him up. Washington treated him like he did many of his aides, Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr included, as really sons. He had no children. These were his sons. And he had offered Arnold a few months earlier the command of the western flank of the American Army. We'll talk about that in a bit, but the point is, Washington recognized Arnold as the best field commander he had. And he was quite ready to promote him as far as he could, and had worked on Arnold's corner his whole career in the Continental Army. So he's very upset. He tries to get Arnold that day. By this time, Arnold's down in New York. It's too late, but he has Andre. He tries to swap Andre for Arnold, gets communication to Clinton. Clinton won't do it. Now, this is interesting. The British honored their commitment to Benedict Arnold. Clinton did, and the King of England did. Throughout the rest of Arnold's life, he really has the support of the crown that that the king is going to back him up. He's going to make sure that he is treated okay in England eventually. And the reason is, of course, that the British didn't want to get a spy and then throw him to the wolves. That doesn't encourage spies in future conflicts, right? So you treat him well. So he wouldn't swap Arnold for Andre. Clinton thought very highly of Major Andre. He wanted to get him back, but he wasn't going to swap Benedict Arnold for him. And Washington was not going to cut Major Andre any slack. He's court-martialed within a few days. He's found guilty of being a spy, which he was. And he's executed on October 2nd. Meanwhile, Arnold on October 8th gets promoted to Brigadier General in the British Army. His wife, who had pleaded ignorance and craziness in front of George Washington on that morning where the messenger came in and told Washington that Arnold had, gave him the note about Benedict Arnold. Peggy acted as though she knew nothing about this. She threw a fit. She's screaming and going hysterical the whole time Washington's in the house. Now, I think as soon as he left, she went up and powdered her nose, but it was a complete act. But the fact is that within a couple of days, Washington ships Peggy Arnold down to Philadelphia, where she was from, to her parents. She's only 19 years old, and sends her under guard to Philadelphia. By October 8th, she's in New York. So she goes down to Philadelphia under guard. A day or two later, turns around and kind of sneaks back to New York. And by the end of December, Benedict Arnold is leading a force of about 1,500 Tories, loyalists, and British regulars into a pretty substantial raid of northern Virginia that goes on for about 6 months. Andre is put in the ground. So that's what we're going to talk about, is Benedict Arnold. Not this bit of Benedict Arnold so much. We'll get to that later, but it's the history before that. Why was Washington so concerned? I mean, this was his reaction on that morning. If Andre can, or if Benedict Arnold can betray us, we're lost, okay? Benedict Arnold was a big deal. So one of the things we want to talk about is, why was Benedict Arnold a big deal? What were his actual contributions here in the early part of the Revolutionary War? The second thing I think you want to keep in the back of your mind is the idea that personal honor and family ties were different 200 years ago than they are today. You can go back to the earliest literature of Western society. Go back to the Iliad and the Odyssey. What's it about? The personal honor of those Greeks. That's what it's about. You can go through the Greeks, you can go through the Romans, you go into the Middle Ages, you get to the early modern period and the gentlemanly code of conduct. This was extremely important to the leading classes of Western society. And I think every place else, but certainly in Western society, that your personal honor was extremely important to you. Certainly was to Benedict Arnold. It certainly was to George Washington. This was a mark of being a gentleman in a very class-ridden society. Gentlemen were here, and the rest of the masses were down here. And you wanted to stay here, and to stay here, your personal honor could not be impinged. And family was your Social Security system. You always had to hang tight to your family. That was really the safety valve of your existence. And so anything that impinged family or your personal honor really was a big deal. And you got to understand that as you think about Benedict Arnold and how he behaves here. The third thing I want you to take away from this is that the American Revolution was a near-run thing. At the point Benedict Arnold goes over, if you were in Las Vegas putting the odds down, you're not betting on the colonies. This thing was almost lost. It was a very near-run thing in 1780 and 1781. And it's really almost lucky about Yorktown. Because if that hadn't happened, if Yorktown hadn't happened, the French were going to get back on their ships and go back to France. Well, we'll talk about this, but the whole American adventure here was ready to collapse. And then the last thing we're going to do is kind of talk about, why did Benedict Arnold really go over? What's kind of ticking around in his brain? Nobody really has the answer, but we'll give you some ideas. Benedict Arnold's Revolutionary War was largely in the Hudson River Valley. He has an incredible expedition in Maine, but mostly his war is in the Hudson River Valley. He's from Connecticut. He leaves Connecticut on the day after Lexington and Concord, and heads to Boston. By the time he gets to Boston, the British are pinned in and surrounded by 20,000 militiamen. They're not going anywhere. And so Benedict Arnold leaves there with a commission to go seize Fort Ticonderoga. And pretty much the rest of his events, other than the very significant expedition in Maine, is along the Hudson River Valley. Benedict Arnold, he is, in my view, he is quite a remarkable character. But you've got to think about why he's remarkable. It's as a soldier. And so the things he talk about, the great attributes of Benedict Arnold, I think you really have to focus on the fact these are the attributes of a soldier. He was clearly an incredible leader of men. He also, unlike many officers, he had both a very strong tactical sense. When you get into combat, what do? And a part of that tactical sense is tied up in his personal bravery. The guy was fearless. But the other side of this is he also had an incredible strategic view. okay? He took a big picture view from the very beginning of what his responsibilities were as an officer. But there's a dark side to Benedict Arnold. It has to do a lot with his upbringing. We'll talk about that in a moment, but the fact is, his background as a boy, his family background, created some, I don't know, some angst in him. And so he wound up being, when you talk about personal honor, and you've got a continuum of 0 to 10, personal honor to Benedict Arnold is about a 12. Okay. George Washington, you're going to put at a 9.5, but Benedict Arnold's off the other end of the spectrum. Okay. His personal honor was extremely important to him. It wasn't unusual for men of what he wanted to be seen as a gentleman. So men of that class, personal honor was extremely important. But Benedict Arnold really wasn't of that class. He wanted to be, so he kind of overcompensated here a bit. He wasn't educated in the way that a gentleman would be educated in the late 19th century or late 18th century. He didn't get to go to Yale. He thought he should have gone, and probably would have had things hadn't gone south in the family, but he didn't. He was not, a particularly articulate guy. He'd be very comfortable in the pub with the sailors and probably purse up a storm with the best of them, but with gentlemen around the table sipping Madeira, nah, he was out of his element. He was not a man of words. He was a man of action, which all of this stuff plays out just fine when you're on the battlefield, but not once you get off the battlefield. And that's where he had his problems. His family was a very prominent family. His great-grandfather, Benedict Arnold I, had come over from England in about 1635, 36, goes into Massachusetts first, and then immediately leaves almost and goes down to Rhode Island. Roger Williams and his colony is established there. When Roger Williams dies, Benedict Arnold I becomes governor of Rhode Island. He's a prominent landowner, merchant, and he's governor of Rhode Island. So the family has very prominent roots in America. The wealth that starts to be accumulated by Benedict Arnold I is pretty much squandered by the time you get to Benedict Arnold's father. So his father is not born in wealth, but he becomes a very successful merchant. The problem is that they had, I think it was 4 children, and 2 of them died young of smallpox or yellow fever or something. And it appears as though that Benedict Arnold's father, also Benedict Arnold, turns into an alcoholic, which is saying something in colonial America. Drinking was, what you did. And so to be recognized as the town drunk takes some doing. But Benedict Arnold's father was the town drunk, became the town drunk. Complete embarrassment to the family. The society, the community he grew up in, pretty much shunned the family, shunned Benedict Arnold, our Benedict. And Benedict spent, his years as 10, 11, 12-year-old being sent by his mother into town to scoop up Dad and get him home. And he'd find him in the pubs, he'd find him on the street, passed out. And the consequence of that is the family fortune is that the father had accumulated is now gone. Benedict Arnold, who started off with a private tutor and was expected to be going to Yale University, can't do it. 12 years old, he is sent off as an apothecary's apprentice to one of his mother's cousins. Family again. He's a worker, right? And so when he finishes his apprenticeship in his early 20s, he had impressed his master, and his master kind of stakes him. He opens an apothecary and bookselling shop in New Haven, which is where he kind of spends his early adulthood, is in New Haven, Connecticut. And very soon is able to acquire shared ownership in three vessels that ply the trade from New England to the West Indies. So he owns 3 ships, or is part owner in 3 ships. He's going down to New England, or going down to the West Indies. He's also going up to Canada, to Quebec, to Montreal. He actually is working a little bit on the Hudson River Valley. So when the war comes, he knows something about that area. And he also developed skills as a sea captain, leading sailors. That certainly has an impact on his ability to lead troops in the American Revolution. So he's doing pretty well for himself, but he's a man who wants to be respected. He builds the biggest house in New Haven, right? He runs things a little bit close to the line here. You didn't necessarily want to do business with Benedict Arnold. He was going to make his money, but he also got himself in debt, which isn't really a problem in that era quite so much yet for him, because he's still early. He is certainly being successful, but the bottom line is he was 16,000 pounds of debt when the revolution started. In any event, because he had been a successful, hard-charging young businessman, ship owner, he gets involved in the Sons of Liberty. He becomes a captain of the militia unit in New Haven, the Sons of Liberty. And when news of Lexington Concord reaches New Haven, he immediately gets his company together. They break into the armory in New Haven and arm themselves. And like the next day, they're off to Lexington, or off to Boston. In Boston, as I say, the British, as soon as they get back from Lexington, they kind of go into Boston, and the colonists surround them. And they're just kind of stuck in Boston for the next year. And so there isn't much going on to excite a guy like Benedict Arnold. He's not one for, camp life. But as I mentioned, he had spent time up and down the Hudson River Valley. He knew about Fort Ticonderoga. He knew that there were guns there, and he knew that the fort was not well maintained. And there was a very small detachment. And he kind of convinced Joseph Warren, who was one of the important guys on the committees of correspondence that were essentially the government of the revolution in Boston at that point, that if you move quickly, you could seize the fort, which was regarded as the Gibraltar of America, this impenetrable fort, and you could seize the cannon. Now, Arnold had actually said this to some other folks from Connecticut as he's going north. The Connecticut Committees of Correspondence got word of this idea, and they commissioned a detachment to go to, well, they didn't exactly commission it, but they sent a message up to Ethan Allen and sort of hired him as a private commission to go take Fort Ticonderoga. Okay. Arnold got a commission formally from he's got a piece of paper that says your job is to raise a regiment, go to Ticonderoga, seize it on behalf of the colony of Massachusetts. So he's got it as a piece of paper, but he's to raise this regiment of 500 or 600 men as he goes towards Ticonderoga and gather it out in Western Mass. This is early June, like June 2nd. He leaves Boston. By the time he gets into Western Mass, a day or two later, he finds out that this Connecticut group, or Connecticut commission sort of, had made its way up to, or was on its way to Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys. So he forgets the whole idea of raising a regiment, just jumps on a horse and races up so that he can get there ahead of Ethan Allen. He has a commission, and so he walks into the, around the campfire where Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys are on the night of the 12th of June, and says, I've got a piece of paper, so I'm in charge. And Ethan Allen and the boys say, I don't think so. I think one of the things to do is kind of equate, this is one of the historians talk about Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys. If you want to think about them, think about Hell's Angels. They're a motorcycle gang. They're a bunch of thugs that were operating up in the area we know now as Vermont before the Revolution, and they were sort of protecting the interests of some of the settlers there against the British and against the colony of New York. But it was a motorcycle gang, right? So they get this sort of commission. They don't have anything in writing, but they've been kind of asked to go see Fort Ticonderoga. They're going to go on the morning of the 13th. Arnold shows up on the evening of the 12th. It's like, you know, some fresh lieutenant from West Point showing up at the Hells Angels biker bar and saying, I'm in charge now. Nah, I don't think so. But Benedict Arnold, first of all, he didn't back down from anybody. But then neither did Ethan Allen. Ethan Allen was bigger, but apparently Benedict Arnold was a pretty well-built guy. Not tall, but well-built. You didn't want to mess with Benedict Arnold. You didn't want to mess with Ethan Allen either, and the two of them kind of looked eye to eye and said, Ethan said, you can come along. So that morning they go see Fort Ticonderoga, pretty easy stuff. In the morning, the Green Mountain Boys, you know, they're rummaging through the supplies in the fort. They find some rum. Let's party, man. So basically what happens is the biker gang spends the next several days partying on the British rum. Benedict Arnold thinks they're just it's a biker gang. And so what he does is, you know, he's not getting along with Ethan Allen at all. Across the river is Crown Point, which is another fort that had blown up in the late 1760s, never been rebuilt, but there were cannon there. It was actually, in many people's view, it was a better site for a fort than Fort Ticonderoga. Benedict Arnold goes across the river, takes control of Crown Point, and immediately begins to think what's next. This, I think, is really an interesting quote about Benedict Arnold. Arnold understood intuitively that a raid or a battle was a brief interruption in the course of war. The real work of fighting was to dig in, to fortify, to gather intelligence, to plan for contingencies. Ethan Allen was not doing any of that, right? Benedict Arnold was. He had no troops. Now, within a fairly short period of time, there's a couple of companies of Massachusetts troops that show up, so at least he has a little bit. And what he does is, when these guys showed up from Massachusetts, they had actually stolen a sloop from a Tory, John Skeens, and had brought that to Crown Point. Arnold arms it. He puts cannon on this civilian sloop. So now he has pretty much the only navy on Lake Champlain, right? Except he does know that up here at the other end of Lake Champlain, where the Richelieu River flows north into the St. Lawrence River, at St. Jean, which is a British fort, just north of that, there is a sloop of war that has, I don't know, a dozen cannon. So what Arnold does is he sends out some scouts to take a look at St. Jean, the fort that controls the Richelieu River up to Montreal, figures out that there's really nobody there, or very few soldiers there, and that this sloop, the Betsy, is a few miles north. So he basically sneaks up Lake Champlain, seizes St. Jean, goes north and gets this sloop of war and brings it down into Lake Champlain. Now he does have the only navy on Lake Champlain. It's just two ships, but when you go to a fight and you're going to show up and you're going to do the Marquis of Queensberry stuff, and the other guy pulls out a Bowie knife, you win. All right? The problem is when somebody else shows up with a gun, then you got a problem. But at least at this point, the Americans had the Bowie knife on Lake Champlain, and the British could not come south because the Americans essentially controlled Lake Champlain. Again, it's this sort of stuff that, I mean, he's doing inventories, he's building fortifications, he's reconnoitering up into the North Woods there to try and keep an eye on what's going on. He's doing all the right stuff. And then there arrives Oh, well, we should talk about this. We need to talk about Canada. Montreal is, of course, at the northern end of the Richelieu River on the Hudson, or on St. Lawrence River. This had been the route that the French and Indians used to invade the American colonies for nearly 100 years by this time, since the 1680s. Warfare between the French and the British, which basically meant the French and Indians and their allies invading colonial settlements down in New York and New England. And the path south out of Canada, the French path, was through Lake Champlain. All the New Englanders knew this. They were terrified of the British enlisting the natives and coming down and raiding their settlements exactly as the French had done. And so they want to block that path south. That's part of what's going on. The second thing, of course, is these 13 colonies kind of look north and say, you know, why wouldn't the Canadians want to come in on this and become essentially a 14th colony or whatever? And so there's kind of two things going on. The Lake Champlain route, you have to block it so the Americans don't get invaded, and again, this particular fear of Native Americans. But it's also the pathway into Canada so that we can seize Canada. And if we can get Canada, then that deprives Britain of a major base of operations and makes us bigger, okay, more powerful. So Benedict Arnold, very early on, sends a communication to the Continental Congress and says, listen, we need to take Montreal, and we need to go now. Guy Carleton, the governor, General Guy Carleton, who was the governor of Canada, had sent all of his troops to Boston. So there's only a handful of British regulars in Canada. Arnold knew this. And so he sends this message that, you know, you need to take Montreal, and you need to do it now before the British reinforce it. And, you know, get yourself a general and send him up. If you can't find a general, I'll do it, okay? Well, they found a general. That general was Philip Schuyler, who was one of these patroons, sort of a patroon, that we talked about yesterday. He's a rich guy, and he's the guy, his daughters marry Alexander Hamilton and Van Rensselaer. So that's that Phil Schuyler. He is a very competent guy, but he's no field commander. Richard Montgomery, who had married the daughter of another one of these landowners, married into the Livingston family, was a soldier. He'd been in the British Army for quite a few years, had a very distinguished record, had come over to America to become a gentleman farmer, he married well, but he has this military background, so he gets drafted in. He really doesn't want to be there, but he goes, and is essentially Schuyler's second in command. Schuyler gets sick, and Montgomery winds up taking over this army that's going to go up into Canada to take Montreal. The interesting thing is, we'll talk, and you'll hear about Benedict Arnold not getting along with many of his peers. He got along with these guys just fine. Benedict Arnold couldn't stand incompetence. He did not suffer fools well at all. And because he really had nothing in the way of smoothness about him, his solution to somebody that he thought was incompetent is to punch him in the head. He never had to punch Schuyler and Montgomery in the head. They were gentlemen. He wasn't going to do that because he wanted to be one of them. But also, they were competent. Schuyler might not have been a field commander, but he was the strategic guy, and he had a lot of skill. In any event, this campaign goes off. Arnold, however, does not go along. What happens is that couple of Massachusetts companies that he was sort of in charge of get withdrawn. Massachusetts doesn't really want to be saddled with taking care of Fort Ticonderoga. So to a large extent, Benedict Arnold's commission is withdrawn. He's left with nothing to do. And so what he does, now, of course, in the meantime, he'd made enemies of most of the lower officers in the area, from Ethan Allen on down. He punched out somebody, he'd challenged somebody to a duel, that they wouldn't fight him because they weren't gentlemen, would be Arnold's view on that. So he's pissed off all kinds of people, these officers in the area, even though he gets along fine with Schuyler and Montgomery. The point is, he has no business in Ticonderoga anymore, in that area. So he packs up and goes back to Boston with a stop through New Haven, where his wife had recently died. Kind of turns a responsibility of his 3 sons over to his sister and proceeds to Cambridge and meets George Washington, who, after hearing about Benedict Arnold's escapades up in Fort Ticonderoga area, is actually very impressed. Again, what he did on Lake Champlain is the mark of a really competent guy. He meets Washington. Along the way, Arnold had kind of mulled over what's going on. And what is happening here is that Montgomery is leading an army up this way to Montreal. Montreal controls this path. That's important. It controls the upper Great Lakes, which is not terribly important yet, but this is hugely important. The problem is the control, where you control Canada is here, Quebec. So getting Montreal is good, but that doesn't give you control of Quebec. It gives you control of the river system. It doesn't give you control of Canada. Get Quebec, and now you've really got something. So theoretically, Montgomery comes up here, then proceeds to go to Quebec. Arnold's idea is, that's good, but what if we sent another force coming from another direction on Quebec? And the other path is essentially up the Kennebec River to the Chaudière River, and then downstream to Quebec on the St. Lawrence. It's a path that the Native Americans had taken for generations, for hundreds of years. But it's Native Americans on foot hauling bow and arrow. Okay? It's not an army. There's no road. But the path was known. Washington found out about it. And so his idea was this. If we go up this path that he is familiar with, he knows it exists, a British officer had written about it, after the French and Indian War. He sends a note to Philip Schuyler and says, he, that is General Carleton, must either break up at Montreal and follow his party and go to Quebec, or he will lose Quebec. He has a choice. He doesn't have enough soldiers to defend both Montreal and Quebec. Carleton either has to stay in Montreal and fight here, which gives this force an open door into Quebec, or he goes to Quebec and leaves Montgomery wide open to take Montreal. Either way, we win, and maybe we win both. So that's what happens. Benedict Arnold, who kind of presented this plan to Washington, Washington talks it over with others, including a representative of Maine, kind of a Sons of Liberty guy up in Maine, and he says, yeah, it's there. And so he commissions Arnold to gather 1,200 picked troops, young men, woodsmen, people that can handle a rifle, not just a musket, people that are going to be fit enough to make this arduous journey. And so he gets 1,200 men. They're broken into 3 companies. Daniel Morgan, who has lots of history in the American Revolution and is a very prominent guy, he heads up 3 rifle companies from Virginia and Pennsylvania. Colonel Greene, who's the brother, I think, or cousin of Nathaniel Greene. Major Meigs, Fort Meigs, that's him, or his son. I'm not sure which one. But they're both named, have this stupid name, Return Meigs. Hi, my name's Return. Nice to meet you. Right. Any event, these are the commanders of the 4 divisions that get created. Major Enos, or Lieutenant Colonel Enos, is bringing up the rear guard. It's the largest, and it's bringing the extra supplies. The idea is that Morgan's group will go first, they'll kind of widen the trail, then Green's group will come, they'll widen the trail a little more, Meigs will come, widen the trail a little bit more, and by the time Enos comes, he's going to have a easier road bringing up these extra supplies that they need. Honestly, this was madness, right? Washington agrees to send them out on September 2nd. September 2nd, in Maine, right? They had like 2 weeks to gather supplies. You know, you can read these notes of some of the soldiers that go on this expedition. You know, it's like they pack a gym bag and off they go. And that's really all they have. They don't have much, right? It's like, okay, run back to your room and get your stuff. We're leaving in 10 minutes. Now, they left in 2 weeks, but they have to gather all kinds of supplies for this march. There's three huge questions here. They're leaving from Massachusetts, and they're going to sail up to Maine. The British Navy is there. What if they ran into the British Navy with this 1,200-man army on transports? It's over. Now, they didn't. Arnold sent out some scouts to try and figure out where the British Navy was. They didn't run into the British Navy. But what are the Native Americans? Do they like the Americans? And what presence do they have on this trail? It's their trail. That's where they lived. What's going to happen if we get into the woods and the natives don't like us? Okay? We've all seen what can happen with that. And then when they come popping out of the Maine woods, what's the reception going to be of the French Canadians? Nobody knew the answer to these questions. So to me, if I was in the room, it's like, what are you doing? This is crazy, right? But by September 2nd, Washington's been convinced. He sends off this Maine Sons of Liberty guy who also happened to have a mill. He could build small boats, bateaus, like rowboats, but pointed at both ends, shallow draft. So he sends Colburn up to, which is where essentially the launching point of this was, near Augusta, Maine, what is now Augusta, Maine, to build 220 bateaux. Right? Think of this. Here, go build 220 boats, you got 2 weeks. And so off he goes, and he builds the boats. The problem is, he didn't have enough seasoned timber, so he's using green wood. Now, Arnold was a sea captain. He knew what was going to happen with green wood. Right? It was going to shrink, it was going to leak. So he knew that. He knew what he was getting. Colberg gets slammed a lot as being, you know, a crook. The fact is, I think he did a pretty good job getting these 220 boats. He knew that there was a problem. Arnold knew there was a problem. Actually, Colburn sent along a squad of his workmen to repair the boats on the way. They knew they were getting shoddy goods, but this is the point. They left. It was very hasty. He sends off a scouting party on September 24th that goes off into the woods and kind of trailblazes the route. They down there die of starvation. And this is a half a dozen experienced woodsmen. They have a hard time with it. And then the next day, Morgan and his riflemen go off, and then the other units go off in a staggered every day or two, they're heading out. Benedict Arnold, if you want to find out what kind of guy Benedict Arnold is, this is where you figure it out. He is incredible. This is a disaster waiting to happen, and he pulls it off because he's thoughtful, he is a motivator, he is in constant motion. Everybody else is in these bateaus. Arnold gets himself a canoe, and he's going from the front of the march to the back of the march. And then he goes the other direction. He's going back and forth in this lighter canoe. Meanwhile, he gets to the Kennebec River. They start heading up. Their first obstacle is the Skowhegan Falls. Same sort of deal. From this point, they're off into the wilderness. There are settlements up until this point, and then they're off. What we dreaded most was the frost and cold from which we began to suffer considerably. Last night it froze so hard as to freeze our wet clothes that we did not lie upon them. The casks started to explode. Food was being ruined. These little boats are starting to, they're expanding. They're leaking into the supplies. You got to ask yourself, what was motivating these people? Well, I can tell you, it's Benedict Arnold, right? In reading about this, it brings to me Henry V, the day before the Battle of Agincourt, on St. Crispin's Day, which is about when these guys are marching up into the Maine woods in late October. St. Crispin's Day is October 25th. But here's one of the soldiers in his diary. He writes, "Their school is the school of fortitude. Their heroic labor, their love of glory, their steady attachment for each other constitute their health and their happiness. Keep up a constant glow of the soul, which the indolent and luxurious never feel. Those abed, those gentlemen in Boston now abed, they never feel this." And it's this pride in what they were doing that was one of the cards that Arnold played continually. Yeah, boy, isn't this crappy? Look at that, you got that stinky old boggy mud all over you. You are an embarrassment. You'll never get a date. But let's go on, boys. Let's go. Let's go. The gentlemen now abed in Boston will regret they were not here. You find these guys that participated in this Maine march all over the American Revolution. Here's the route. They come up from Augusta, up the Kennebec River, and then when you get to a point right here, this is at the start of the Great Carry, which is a 13-mile overland route that takes you from the Kennebec River to the Dead River, and from the Dead River you go to the height of land, which is a mountain ridge, maybe a couple thousand feet high, 1,000 to 2,000 feet high in this area that you have to cross, and then you get to Lake Megantic, which is essentially this area is where the Chaudière River starts. And then from there, theoretically, it's the Chaudière River down to Quebec. That's the theory. So they get into this area at the Great Carry, and you can go hiking there if you want. And they start moving. Now, here's the thing with the Great Carry. It works if you're carrying a bow and arrow and a pocket full of pemmican. But when you've got these boats and you've got supplies and you've got ammunition and gunpowder that you need to get, it's 1,000 feet up, 13 miles. You can't carry everything in one trip, so you got to come back. Do it again. Come back. Do it again. It took them at least 3 trips, maybe 4. It wasn't 1,000 feet. It wasn't 13 miles. It was 3,000 feet, 60, 75 miles, and the weather's going bad. They get to the Dead River, at least some of them get there October 22nd. They're asleep that night, and it rains. There's apparently a hurricane that's blowing itself out, and it's dumping all kinds of water in northern Maine. The Dead River floods 8 feet in 8 hours. They're camped alongside of it. All of their debris, all of their equipment gets kind of washed downstream. The divisions behind them start to pick up some of this stuff. They're going through the woods trying to gather up all this stuff. They've lost lots of supplies. I love Benedict Arnold's quote in his diary. "This morning presented with a very disagreeable situation. It really wasn't good this morning." Next day, So what happens is he calls a council of war. The commander calls this council of war of his officers, and they kind of talk about their situation. They're in trouble. They're in deep doo-doo right now. They've lost a lot of food. They've lost some of their ammunition. The route is 300 miles. He thought it was going to be 160. It's much longer than he thought. They're using up their supplies. They're losing their supplies. So what are we going to do? We can turn around and go back, or we can keep going. So he listens to them. And then after they're done, he says, okay, we got a problem. Here's my idea. And his idea was he was going to take 50 guys, and they were going to go as fast as they could up into Canada, get to the French Canadians, acquire supplies, turn around, bring those supplies back to the army while the army trudges ahead as best they can. And the officers say, okay. And Benedict Arnold packs up, takes his 50 men, and heads north. The next day, the guy in the rear guard, Enos, comes up and catches up with Greene. The officers of Enos insist on a council of war of their own. It's Enos's officers and Greene's officers. Enos's officers want to turn around and go back. Greene's don't. Greene's guys keep going forward. Enos turns around and goes back, taking all of the surplus supplies with him. Thank you very much. So about this time, they're breaking out of the Dead River. They're getting to the height of land. Dear wife, this is October 26th, the day after St. Crispin's Day, by the way. Dear wife, I'm at this time well, but in a dangerous situation, as is the whole detachment. We are in a wilderness country 100 miles from any inhabitants, either French or English, and about 5 days' provision. If the French are our enemy, it will go hard for us, for we have no retreat left. May God in his infinite wisdom or infinite mercy protect you, my more than ever dear wife, and my dear children. Adieu. Not a very optimistic note, right? And this is the height of land off in the distance you can see here. This is a photo from the top of Bigelow Mountain overlooking, that's all flooded area now. It's been dammed and it's a reservoir, but that's the Dead River. So they get over the height of land. They start heading down into Canada, which is obviously good news. And they have to get to the Megantic River. Turns out the Megantic River, the direction they're coming from, this is all swamp. And it's in this passage from the height of lands just past the Megantic River that Benedict Arnold's army really takes a beating. They kind of split up. There's no point in doing anything other than and they don't have any supplies at this point. They've run out of food. It's like you need to get up into this area, okay, where the Chaudière River comes out and starts heading towards Quebec. That's your destination. Get there. Good luck. About 50 of them apparently died in this stretch. They drowned in the swamps. They froze to death. They starved to death. Who knows? But Arnold lost about 50 men in this area. And yet, Arnold does get to the French settlements as the soldiers start to break the woods around the northern end, the northern end of Lake Megantic. Off in the distance, a vision of horned cattle, 3 horned cattle and 2 horses. Arnold is arriving. And he spends the next couple of days just getting food up and down the line of his troops. Again, I think the reaction of the French Canadians was, what the hell are you doing here? This is crazy. Well, part of the problem is that through all of this, the folks in Quebec find out that Arnold is coming. When Arnold kind of breaks out of the woods, Quebec is almost completely defenseless. But on November 12th, a Scottish officer who had been in the British Regular Army, I think he's basically retired at this point, he puts together a couple of companies of probably retired British regulars, and he goes in unauthorized into Quebec and basically bucks up the lieutenant governor, who was pretty much useless, okay? But Maclean takes over and starts to build up the defenses of Quebec. Meanwhile, Arnold's army had started to break out of the woods around November 1st. Not all of them, but again, they're going in stages. By November 9th, they're opposite. There's Quebec. They're on the opposite side. They need to get across the river. Maclean had destroyed or taken all of the boats on the south shore, so it takes a couple of days for Arnold to wind up, to find enough troops. He gets across the St. Lawrence River with about 2/3 of his troops before a storm came up, and then issues this very bold command. You know, he's starving, right? I am ordered by His Excellency George Washington to take possession of the town of Quebec. I do, therefore, in the name of the United Colonies, demand immediate surrender of the town and fortifications and the city of Quebec. To which Colonel McLean goes, the fact is that Arnold's army had 5 rounds per man. They couldn't do anything. Either the Canadians surrendered or Arnold was beaten. And so he heads downstream a few miles to wait for Montgomery. By this time, Montgomery had chased Carleton out of Montreal, and Montgomery is on his way towards Quebec. Arnold's failure to take Quebec when he came out of the woods, and he had maybe 24, 48 hours where maybe it could have happened. But then McLean got there and it was over. The point is, once you get to this situation where Arnold is waiting for Montgomery, the whole point of the expedition is over. It was a wasted effort. Courageous, tremendous effort, demonstrates all kinds of skill and bravery and courage and gumption, but it's a wasted effort because that whole idea of getting to Quebec without it being defended was lost. And they're waiting for Montgomery anyhow. So Montgomery arrives, it's early December. They hang around for a bit trying to get the British to surrender Quebec. They don't. They don't have much in the way of cannon or food or anything else. And one logical thing to do is simply retreat and go back to Montreal. But both Montgomery and Arnold kind of say, we've come this far, we got to do something. And so they attack Quebec on New Year's Eve, 1775, in the midst of a snowstorm, which they wanted. They were waiting for a storm that could kind of obscure their attack. There's a few kind of fakes here against the main walls outside of the Plains of Abraham, for those of you who are Wolfen fans. But the main detachments under Montgomery and under Arnold go around the city to the north with the intention of trying to break in at the lower town. It's a complete failure. Montgomery, within a very few minutes after leading his troops to the south, run into a barricade. Montgomery and his second in command are both killed in grape shot from cannon fire. That detachment just disappears and heads back to the base. Arnold leads his army, the stragglers from the march, around to the north side, and they have some initial success but get stopped pretty quickly. Arnold is wounded pretty seriously, dragged into one of the buildings, and then later taken to a hospital a little bit further from Montreal, or from Quebec. Virtually the entire force is captured and held prisoner by the British for almost a year. Okay, then they are released, but initially they are all captured, pretty much, including Morgan and Meigs and Greene. In the winter of 1776, the Americans tried to maintain this siege, but they don't have enough firepower to get in. Carleton has no interest in marching out and fighting the Americans because he knows come spring, reinforcements are going to arrive. Arnold is eventually carted back to Montreal, where he kind of recovers from his wound. And in the spring, when everybody wakes up, the British arrive with some 13,000 troops. And the Americans have maybe 1,500 around Quebec, maybe another 1,500 in Montreal. It's time to get back to Ticonderoga, and that's what happens. They just kind of race back to Ticonderoga. Along the way, Arnold, of course, has his typical rows with some of his peers. He makes some new enemies, as if he doesn't have enough, not with the commander, but with some of mostly his peers. They get back to Ticonderoga, and it's clear that in order to defend Ticonderoga, you have to take control of Lake Champlain. This is the route south, and you need to control it. Well, Arnold knew that the year before. That's why he had those 2 sloops of war that he had put together on Lake Champlain. And so Schuyler tells Benedict Arnold, build me a navy. And so Benedict Arnold went to work building a navy. It's not a big navy, it's a dozen ships, not much more than 70 or 80 cannon mounted on these ships. They are mostly rowed galleys with sails. He has one or two larger ships, but most of them are rowed galleys with a few guns on them. And he gets that navy in existence pretty early, which means that Carleton, with this newly arrived army, can't move south until he gets a navy to brush aside Arnold's navy. Arnold's navy is going to be small. Arnold has the Bowie knife now, right? But Carleton needs to build the gun to bring to the knife fight, which he does. And he spends all summer building the navy that in early October moves south and essentially brushes Arnold's navy aside. The importance of Arnold's navy is not that it fought the British at Valcour Island. That's a sideshow, quite honestly. The important thing was that he had a navy at all. He had the knife at the fist fight. And the British could not move south until they got that knife out of the fight or showed up with a gun. And they showed up with a gun. Arnold, or the Americans then, retreat essentially to Fort Ticonderoga, which is here, and wait for Carleton to show up. He does in the early November. He gets there, he takes a look at Fort Ticonderoga, takes a look at the weather, and says, nah, winter's coming, folks. We're not going to lay siege here to Fort Ticonderoga now. So he turns around and goes back to Montreal, ending the threat to the United States from the north in the year 1776. This is important because anybody know what's happening at the southern end of the Hudson River Valley at that very moment? Yeah, the British are chasing Washington out of New York. New York had been abandoned. Howe is in control of New York City. If Carleton had gotten to Albany at this point, who knows? Now, Andre, at this point, there's a series of promotions to general. Arnold has been made brigadier general, but there's promotions to major general. He doesn't get one, and he's not a happy guy. Some of the guys that do get promoted are clearly incompetent in his view, and probably they were incompetent. They were promoted largely for political reasons. So he doesn't get a job. He doesn't get promoted. And he's just ready to quit. He heads back to Connecticut. While he's in Connecticut, there's a British raid. This is in kind of the spring of 1777. There's a raid to Danbury, sort of like the British are coming to Lexington and Concord. Here, the British are coming to Danbury to seize supplies and destroy colonial supplies. They arrive by ship. They go on this roundabout path. There's no resistance at all. They just land and start marching. Arnold, who is in the area but has no command, starts to put together what militia forces he can find to offer defense. There's about 2,000 British troops on this march. He's able to kind of cobble together a force of about 500, 600, 700 and meets them at a couple of different places. I don't know, he got 3 horses shot out from under him. You know, he's right in the thick of the battle. He finds places where he can delay the British. He can't stop them, he's not strong enough, but he inflicts 2 or 3 times as much damage on the British as they inflict on the Americans. Eventually, the British do get back to the sea and they head back to New York. And as a consequence of this, Congress appoints him as a major general. But his promotion date is 6 months or 5 months after those other guys got promoted major general, so he is their subordinate. Arnold doesn't want that, okay? He wants to be treated the way he thinks he should be treated, and you know, basically his response is this: they're promoting junior officers to the rank of major general, and not me. I view as a very civil way of requesting my resignation as being unqualified for the office to hold. That's the note he sends to George Washington. Washington more or less agrees. He understands this this issue of personal honor. So does Nathaniel Greene. This is a note that Daniel Greene wrote to John Adams. John Adams, by the way, was essentially the Secretary of War, as well as the head of a dozen other committees. I fear your late promotions will give great disgust to many. Because the soldiers, these hardcore officers, they resented the way these promotions were being made. And Arnold's ready to quit over this. Washington talks him down. After he is promoted to Major General, he's still angry because he doesn't get the commission date that he thinks he deserves. So Washington still thinks he will not act, most probably, under those he commanded but a few weeks ago. He understands. Okay? He lets, Arnold does go to Washington's army, and Washington kind of gives him permission to go to Congress and argue his case. He goes, it doesn't work. John Adams' response is, the threat of them retiring. He's fed up, frankly, with these officers wanting more and more and their code of honor kind of stuff. He doesn't have much use for that. If they have virtue, they will continue with us. If not, their resignation will not hurt us. That's Adams' view. It's a nice view. It's not very realistic in the world that existed at the time. In any event, while this is bubbling in the early summer, late spring of 1777, General Burgoyne is putting command of the new invasion army of this British army that's up in Montreal. And Burgoyne begins his march south down this Lake Champlain path. At the same time, there's a second army under St. Leger that composed of loyalists and regulars and Native Americans. And they're coming this direction. Burgoyne comes down, by this time, of course, there's no American fleet on Lake Champlain. They go immediately to Ticonderoga, capture it pretty easily, and Burgoyne begins his march south from Ticonderoga on July 5th. Here's where things start to get hard for Burgoyne. He's marching through the woods, and the Americans, under Schuyler at this point, Schuyler's still the commander up here, Schuyler's kind of offering a kind of a scorched earth defense. He has no intention of meeting Burgoyne in straight up battle. He's going to make it hard. He's going to wait for winter to get here, quite honestly. Set up defenses on the Hudson River, north of Albany, make Burgoyne's march as miserable as possible, hope they run out of food, and we won't have to fight them at all. They'll turn around like they did last year. And that's Schuyler's strategy, which is ultimately what happened. Now, in the meantime, this invasion force of St. Leger's is coming up this direction, and in early August they seize Fort Stanwix, you might know it as. At the time, it was called Fort Schuyler, renamed after General Schuyler. And a relief force is sent a few days later to try to lift the siege under General Herkimer. It fails. There's a very bloody battle at Oriskany. And the Americans are pushed back. A couple of days later, news gets to now General Gates is in charge of the American army on the Hudson River. Schuyler had been replaced. Gates was a very competent former British officer, so it's not a bad choice. Schuyler's, I mentioned, he's not a field commander. So Gates takes control. He doesn't want to send any reinforcements to help at Fort Stanwix, but Arnold says, I'll go. They had cobbled together a force of about 700 men, and Arnold sets off. But before he goes, he sends off basically a double agent, a recognized Tory, kind of kidnaps this guy's brother and says, deliver this message or your brother's in trouble. And the message was essentially Arnold's on his way with 2,000 men. He gets to the siege at Fort Stanwix, the Native Americans. By this time, Arnold has a reputation. He is highly regarded by both the British and the Native Americans as somebody they really don't want to mess with. And he's showing up with 2,000 men. We only have 1,000. We're gone. And the natives are the one that's first skedaddle. Part of it is they didn't want to, they figured that they were in trouble, but part of it was they don't like sieges. They weren't getting the kind of trophies that they wanted, and so they just skedaddled. And once the natives leave, St. Ledger has no choice. He has to break off the siege and head north. So a couple days later, Benedict Arnold walks into Fort Stanwix without firing a shot. And then immediately turns around and heads back to where Gates is, kind of built his fortifications just north of the little town of Saratoga, on a place called Bemis Heights. The fortresses, the fortifications laid out there were built by Thaddeus Kosciuszko. Thaddeus Kosciuszko is this Polish military engineer who had come over to the States in 1776 or 77. He also, a couple years later, designs and lays out the fortifications at West Point. So Thaddeus Kosciuszko is really, he's a pretty important guy here in the American Army. Any event, by this time, Burgoyne is in trouble. He had sent off one of his about 700-800 British or German Hessians to try to seize supplies at Bennington, Vermont. They all got captured. Didn't get the supplies, and he lost nearly 1,000 men. So he's down to 6,000 to 7,000 effectives. It's winter is approaching. It's now mid-September. Evenings are getting cool. This is in the days before global warming. And so he's in trouble, and he knows he's in trouble. Part of his salvation is he still thinks that there's going to be a relief force coming north from New York City. He's kind of pinning his hopes at this point that there's an army coming north along the Hudson, which was sort of the original plan, not firmly agreed to. So instead of sending a relief force up, Howe went and took Philadelphia instead, which meant that there weren't enough troops in New York to come up to relieve Burgoyne. In any event, the Americans set up their defenses here. Burgoyne gets into this area in early September. They try to launch, try to flank the American army going this way. As it turns out, the guy in command of this part of the American army is our friend Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold actually does a brilliant job here, commanding his forces, directing them at various points in the battle. This is not one of those battles where Benedict Arnold is out on his horse leading the charge. He's really in the background, watching what's going on, feeding in troops at various parts of the battle as necessary. And the point is, while the British maintain the battlefield, they are stopped. Okay? And all you need to do here is stop the British. You don't have to beat them. So they set up fortifications here on a place called Freeman's Farm. A couple of weeks later, remember, Burgoyne is waiting for reinforcements, so he's not real eager to launch new attacks. He wants to find out whether anybody's coming from the south. But eventually, he's running out of food, he's running out of fodder for his horses. He sends out a reconnaissance in force from where he had originally set up these fortifications on Freeman's Farm a few weeks earlier. And here, Arnold again comes out and meets him. This time, Arnold is in the midst of the battle. He's on horseback, riding back and forth and leading charges and all that sort of thing. Late in the day, he gets shot badly here and is carted off the field. But again, Burgoyne is stopped. Arnold is seriously wounded. They were going to amputate his leg. He says, no, if we don't amputate your leg, you're going to die. And he says, well, then I'm going to die. Death held no trouble for him, right? He was a very fatalistic, really, in many ways. In any event, he doesn't die, but his leg shrivels. He walks with a limp for the rest of his life because, I don't know, his left or right leg is 3 inches shorter than the other one. In any event, the Burgoyne is stopped. He surrenders to Gates. Gates becomes a hero. Arnold is barely mentioned, and yet he's the guy that is leading both of these defenses against Burgoyne. After Saratoga, the British kind of look at their situation and say, you know what? If New England wants to be independent, let them. But we're going to keep New York City. We're going to keep Canada. With our Indian allies, we'll maintain control of the area west of the Appalachians, and we're going to send our army into the south to seize these southern colonies. And so really from this point on, from the summer of 1788 on, other than the retreat of the British from Philadelphia that they had seized in 1777, they retreat in 1778. Other than that, almost all the fighting is in the south. Nothing happens in the north. Washington pretty much camps out north of New York City for the rest of the war, and kind of pins in, to a certain extent, the British Army at New York City, always dreaming of when he's going to attack New York City. That's what his goal is. But the fighting is down here. The other thing that happens is the British say, this is taking a lot more effort than we want. In order to keep the French from coming in, maybe we should make peace with the Americans. And they pass in Parliament what's known as the Conciliatory Acts, a series of laws repealing the offensive laws they had passed against the Americans prior to the Revolution. And the idea is, see, you don't have a complaint anymore. And they're going to send over the Carlisle Commission to negotiate with Congress to reestablish the connection with the empire. Congress basically tells the Carlisle Commission to go bugger itself. The French arrive at about the same time with a treaty arrangement. The French drag in the Spanish. Eventually, the Dutch come in. And so what you have are the British fighting now against the French, the Spanish, the Dutch, and the Americans. None of these guys had much interest in what was going on in the United States. The French did send over some troops. They did send over a navy that kind of operated in what we know as the United States, but that army didn't arrive until 1780. The Navy's a little bit effective on the coast of the United States, but not a lot. Most of the fighting is down in the Caribbean, and it's effective because what it does is it spreads the British Empire out thin. But none of these guys really did much in the United States other than the Rochambeau's army that arrives in 1780 and only stays a little over a year. Right? That's enough, as it turns out. But it does make it a global war. What happens to Benedict Arnold? Well, he's seriously wounded. He spends 6 months recovering, finishes his recovery really with a game leg. He's in pain constantly. Washington needs him. He puts him in charge as military governor of Philadelphia right after the British withdraw in the spring of 1778. Arnold moves in as the governor general. Philadelphia turned out to be a very nice duty for the British. The Philadelphians seemed to like the British when they were there in 1777 and 1778. They had a grand old time. And the Philadelphians had no problem selling stuff to the British. Arnold shows up, and he thinks these guys are a bunch of snakes, right, these Philadelphians, and yet he sorts of pals up with the Loyalists. Now, part of the reason is Washington told him, don't make enemies of the Loyalists. We need them to produce stuff that my army needs, so don't rankle them. But Arnold, I think, went a little overboard. He became pretty friendly with them. He took advantage of his position to kind of feather his own nest a little bit. And he met Peggy Shippen, who was this 18-year-old charming young lady. And in the spring of the next year, he marries Peggy Shippen. Interestingly, in May, when he marries Peggy Shippen, he also opened up communication with the British through a friend of his, Joseph Stanhope. Started communicating with Clinton in New York about what I can do to help. Essentially, at the beginning, Arnold says, I will come over to your side if you make me a general. And Clinton says, we'd love to have you on our side, but if you're going to come over, I want you to come over with something substantial. I want you to come over under a situation where your treason is going to help me destroy Washington's army or do something significant to harm the American cause, not simply change uniforms. That wasn't enough for Clinton. So essentially what happens is for the next year, Arnold is in Philadelphia feeding such information as he can to Clinton. It's not terribly helpful. He's given him decent information, but it's not game winner stuff. In the meanwhile, the fighting's going on in the South. And by the time you get to 1780, this whole thing is starting to collapse for the Americans. 1779 to 1781 are just horrible experiences. Congress is failing to supply the troops. The states are not stepping up to their duty. There's mutiny in the Continental Army. Officers and men are not being paid. There's desertion. People are not re-upping for another term of service. By the time you get to the spring of 1781, it's like the French army, which is in Rhode Island, is ready to get back on a ship and go back to France without having fought. Washington writes, without foreign loan, our present force, which is but the remnant of an army, cannot be kept together. We are at the end of our tether. It's about over. In June, in the spring of 1780, Arnold has now been a year and a half recovering. Washington offers him command of the left wing of his army, which is brilliant, okay? He wants Arnold back in the saddle. Arnold says, I can't get back in the saddle yet. I'm still not ready. But what you could do in the meantime is put me in command of, something like West Point. Now, command of West Point gives Arnold something he can trade to Clinton that is potentially a war winner, okay? And so the negotiations pick up again. Clinton all along was suspicious that he was not necessarily negotiating with Arnold. He couldn't believe Arnold was going to come over, honestly. He didn't think he was talking to Arnold. They didn't have, FaceTime, okay? He was getting text messages, and he didn't know that he was really texting with Benedict Arnold. He needed to see him in the face, and they didn't have FaceTime then. So what he needed to do, once Arnold gets up to West Point, is he needs to confirm the arrangements, and he also wants to confirm that he's really talking to Benedict Arnold. And so he sends up his essentially intelligence officer, John Andre, and Andre and Arnold put together a scheme where they're going to meet. Andre's going to come up on that ship, the Vulture, as I mentioned before, and they're going to meet, and Arnold's going to lay out the plans of West Point so Andre can take them back to Clinton. Clinton's assembling his army to move on West Point in early September, in mid-September. He's ready to go. He just wants to get these plans. And he wants to confirm that Andre is really talking to Benedict Arnold. So Andre comes north. He has the meeting on the Vulture, has the meeting with Arnold. Has to stay overnight. He goes across the river to the east side of the river. The meeting is over on the west side, the side where West Point is. And he gets, he's on the west side of the river. But then when it comes time for him to go back south, the Vulture had been fired upon by an American colonel who was irritated with the fact that the Vulture was there. He had no orders. He just kind of on his own said, I don't like you guys hanging around. So he lobs a few shells, makes a few hits. The Vulture kind of cuts their cable and drifts downstream. So when Andre is ready to go back on board the Vulture's gone. And so he's ferried across the river and starts riding south. And that's where we picked up the story at the beginning of this on September 23rd. In the end, Andre is hung. Arnold winds up as a general, goes into Virginia for 6 months, does a pretty destructive job. He's a good commander. And then he loses command of that group. Partially, there's a superior that comes down, and then he dies, and Arnold's back in charge. And then Cornwallis arrives. His troops now, Arnold's troops now fall under the command of Cornwallis, which made sense. But Cornwallis doesn't want Arnold. So he sends Arnold back to Washington, or to New York. Clinton, when Cornwallis starts to move out the Virginia Peninsula, the James Peninsula, and Cornwallis is clearly in trouble. He sends Arnold on a raid into Connecticut to Fort Griswold and New London, These are about 14 miles south of where Arnold grew up. Okay, so he goes back home, leads this raid, burns New London, Fort Griswold. There's actually probably a pretty blatant massacre of some 85 American troops at Fort Griswold. Now, he wasn't there, but his subordinate probably butchered these guys. In any event, by December, by mid-October, end of October, Cornwallis has surrendered. The game's up, the war's effectively over, even though the peace treaty hasn't been signed. And on December 15th, Arnold sails back to England with Peggy. The rest of his life, he more or less works as a merchant and sea captain. He's in London initially. He goes to Canada, is up in New Brunswick, spends several years there, goes back to London in the 1790s. He apparently took about a dozen voyages down into the West Indies. He's not horribly successful. He's not a pauper, but he's not achieving great wealth either. One of the things that happens, again, we talked about, well, here we are. How did the British react to him? Well, the Whigs, who were the ones who were opposed to the revolution to begin with, they despised Arnold, okay? The Tories, who were in favor of the war, they sort of put up with Arnold. The king, as I mentioned earlier, he was quite interested in making sure that Arnold was treated well. And so he backed Arnold, he backed his family. In the late 1790s, he's given 13,000 acres of land up north of Toronto. Peggy Shippen herself and her children are given pensions, in addition to Benedict Arnold's pension as a retired British general. And then, as it comes to us all, Benedict Arnold dies in 1801. Gout, dropsy, take him. When he dies, he doesn't have much liquid cash. He's not a pauper, but he doesn't have much liquidity. He has debt and no liquidity. Peggy Arnold seems to have been able to pay all that off before she died 3 years later. She's still a very young woman. She's only like in her mid-40s, but she dies of cancer. His first sons under his first wife all become officers in the British Army. With Peggy, he had they died as children, but he has 4 sons and a daughter who lives to maturity. The sons never marry from the first wife, so there's none of that. That all dies out. But Peggy Shippen's, the kids he has with Peggy Shippen, there's ancestors of those, or descendants of those. All of his sons become officers in the British military. 6 in the Army, 1 in the Navy. This guy becomes a general and is knighted. Sophia never marries, but the boys do. Now, why did he do all this? He wrote this proclamation a few days after he went over, in which he explained his motives. Essentially, the war had lost its basis. We fought the war because we had these grievances against the empire. The Carlisle Commission and those conciliation acts ended the complaint, okay? The British did what we wanted them to do back in 1775. Now let's go back into the fold. And Congress pretty much had no use for even negotiating with the Carlisle Commission. So what Arnold thinks, at least this is what he says, is that we lost our opportunity. The revolution, which was fought about these grievances, now is being led by these radicals in Congress. So that's part of it. He wanted to kind of reconnect the Americans with their kinsmen as part of the Great British Empire. That's what he puts in this and some other things, like he hates the French. But then you really get to what's really going on here. Is it about the money? Arnold liked money. He had lost his personal wealth in the war. He wasn't being treated fairly by Congress. That's certainly true. So money is undoubtedly a big driver here. He was negotiating for 20,000 pounds. 20,000 pounds in 1777, 1780 was several $1 million today. He didn't get that. He only got 6,000 pounds. But 6,000 pounds is about $1 million. And then he got a commission in the British Army with a pension. that was 300 or 400 pounds a year, which is still a pretty substantial income. The other thing, of course, you got to recognize is he made a lot of enemies, and he detested Congress. He detested a lot of the leaders. He thought that these guys really were in it for their own good. His experience in Philadelphia, and which of these are the real reasons? He takes your bet. You place your money, you make your bet. I don't know. I don't think anybody could ever know. But he went to his grave thinking he had done the right thing. He had no reservations about it. It isn't like he had a deathbed vision of, gee, I shouldn't have done this. Not at all. So there you go.
Thank you very much, Jim. Have a great day.
I dipped into your lunch, but if anybody has any questions, you can come up and ask.